Welcome to week 2, part 2. Remember those patterns that we worked so hard to build? We're actually going to break those patterns with a dramatic climax in this portion. So climax. What is the climax? The climax is really the heart and soul of your story. This is where all the feelings in your story of your primary character will reach a fever pitch. Okay? You've drafted your setup, you've drafted your propelling event, and you've done your escalation, as in the first part of this week. So you've set the scene, you've established place and time, you've drawn your main characters, and you've kicked off the action of the story, and you've created a pattern. Now it's time to break that pattern. Remember our friends, the 3 little pigs? The climax happened in that story when the big bad wolf shows up to blow down the little third pig's house, the one made of bricks. But he can't do it for once. He's blown down the one made of straw, the one made of sticks, but the bricks, that's the kicker here. He can't do it. You want the same thing for your story. You want action that breaks the pattern and leads to a change from your characters before to their after. Remember, we want to surprise our reader, but at the same time, we want to have them believe that this outcome was completely plausible. It works for the 3 little pigs, it works for Reunion and John Cheever's story, and it works with everyday use. Because I think those authors have thought about the arc of the story, okay? Especially with the modern stories, not necessarily the 3 little pigs, but there's 2 conflicts in our story. There's the external conflict, which is the outside action, what happens, and then there's the internal conflict, which has to happen internally before our character can change. So the arc is really kind of a little mountain. It's not necessarily a peak, but it's a slow progression of things happening. The climax is the highest point on that arc. It should be your most dramatic point, period. So our external and our internal conflict in the perfect world certainly merge together and come together at that highest point. In everyday use, for example, the main action of our story is Dee coming to visit Mama and Maggie. Okay, the climax is the point when Dee's want of the homemade quilts collides with Mama's need to refuse her. Mama has wanted to please Dee all along, but their worlds collide and Mama's needing to take those quilts back. Okay, let's take a look at this drawn out. I drew this out in a very unprofessional, it's obviously not artistic, but I wanted to give you just an idea of what our elements are. We've done the setup. We've seen how Walker has written that. She's put us in place and time. We've seen the propelling event when Dee announces her new name. That's number 2. For the escalation, Dee takes the butter churn top. She takes the dasher 2. She takes the homemade quilts. Number 4 is when Mama decides to take definitive action and she snatches those homemade quilts away. She said these were for Maggie. She's had it. She senses in the background, if you read the story very carefully, you'll see that she hears a door slam and she realizes that Maggie was upset and those quilts were to be Maggie's marriage portion. What would happen when Maggie eventually married. And we also know through the backstory that Mama says that she had offered these quilts to Dee before and Dee didn't want them. Now Dee wants them to turn them into museum pieces, to put them on display, to not actually use them. Okay, and eventually Dee says, but Maggie's just going to use those quilts every day. And Mama says, well, that's what they're for. Maggie can make more. Dee can't. Dee just she tries to offer her the machine-made quilts. It's not good enough for Dee. But Mama, the most important thing, Mama has triumphed here because she has reached the climax. And that's the high point of that story. It is, in some sense, I think every bit as dramatic as what happened in Reunion. They didn't get kicked out of restaurants, but you have a lot of things going on internally. And so that's important. When you think about your climax, think about what your story arc would be and build it like this. You have your setup. You can put your setup here in the background. Your setup reflects the before. Mom admired Dee in the beginning, right? And then you have your propelling event. That's actually the first element in what will turn into your escalation because that has to kick off the action. That has to happen. Then the escalation happens with the 3 elements. And it doesn't have to be 3, it can be 2. Many times it is in stories. You have 3 total beginning with the propelling event. Depends on really what you need in the story, and some of these can come from your treasure chest. The butter churn had two elements. It had the top, the lid, and it had the dasher. So that led to a nice progression of what Dee wanted. And Walker was again an expert in making this work for us and creating the drama that we deserve for our story and our characters. Internal conflict. If you're not sure what to do for your story's climax, and this is very common, it is one of my most troubling problems, because sometimes I've got to make sure, it's difficult to make sure that it's going to be the highest plot point, what we talked about. Think about what your character wants. Make a list of all the characters in your story, then write down what each of them wants. Once you have your list, all you have to do is ask yourself for each character, did they get what they want? Did they not get what they want? Does what they want change? What's going to be most important in your climax will be the wants of your primary character. Okay? Dee, her wants don't change at all. So she's not going to have change as a character. She's not going to change. We can't really have her change too in this story. Walker has Mama change because she's the linchpin. She's everything in this story, and she changes, and that's where your climax comes from. That's when Mama's needs change, really. That's when they start to. We'll talk about a little more about that in resolution, but all of a sudden she's not as interested in what Dee wants anymore. She's more interested in what she wants through really what Maggie wants and needs, and that's the beauty of this wonderful story. So remember, think about the wants. And then think about the progression, of internal and conflict and climax. We talked about this a little bit. The climax when Mama snatches those quilts away, Dee doesn't get what she wants for the first time in her life. Maggie, for once in her life, possibly, does get something she wants, and we know she deserves it. And Mama, finally, before Dee can take off the chimney, the windows, get away with taking everything from their house, Mama is the one who stands up for herself and Maggie, the daughter she's finally starting to admire. She may have wanted to impress Dee, but something inside Mama changed, and we are so glad because we knew that she had it in her. Now, look at the internal and the external conflict and the internal. In this story arc, what I've done is draw it out for you. You see the propelling event, what happens, Dee announces her name. You see on the underside of the arc, Mama is confused, but she agrees to call Dee by her new name. She says, okay, I'm going along with it right now. Then Dee takes the butter churn top, and then on the other side of that arc, you see Mama, she doesn't resist, but she's starting to think about this. What's going on with this? You mean you're not going to use these things? Then Dee takes the dasher too. Mama gives in again, but she's the one who muses about the wood and how someone in her family had carved that for her. And she's getting, I think, a little nostalgic here about giving that up. But she's not resisting, because remember, what she wants is to impress Dee. Okay? She wants Dee to be happy. That's what she thinks she wants. Then when Dee goes to the trunk and goes into Mama's bedroom, can you imagine? Takes those two quilts from there and takes them away and says, I'm going to hang these up on the wall. She's not even going to use them. Mama resists, and she said, well, if you're just going to hang them on the wall, why don't you take two machine-made quilts? You know what's happening inside of Mama. Mama's taking some action, but what's more important on the underside of the arc is what Mama's thinking. Okay. And Dee says, no, that's not good enough. I want these. And then that's the beauty of the climax. That is when Mama snatches those quilts away, and she says, these are for Maggie. Okay, so when you start to write your climax, I want you to think about your story arc. Start with your setup, your propelling event. Just sketch it out. Do your escalation. Do your external actions on one side if you want to, and then do your internal reaction. The internal action, the internal reflection inside, and any action that Mama takes is a reaction to those external actions. So if you want your story to really build to that wonderful climax, you're going to have the external action and the internal conflict actually merge to that beautiful climax. That's what happens. So where do you get ideas for your climax, right? It seems like it's a little bit easier for Reunion and a little bit easier for Walker, but only because they've already done their work. Walker and Cheever have done a lot of work. She's thought about it. He's thought about it, and she's thought about it. So what you want to do is find a place where your conflicts, external and internal, can peak. Draw your arc out. And really, I think the pivot point here is to ask yourself, how is my character feeling during that escalation? Now, what are they going to do about those feelings? How might he or she break the pattern of those traumatic events? How does the secret factor in? The secret comes out in a beautiful way in everyday use, and that's when Mama remembers to herself that she had offered these homemade quilts to Dee before she left home, and they weren't good enough then. That's important. So if you have a secret that you've been building or some information that you've been holding back, and sometimes you can actually write that while you're working towards the climax, and you can go back and revise. If you remember some information or you think of something that would be helpful, you can actually, we're not through with writing our story, right? We're writing the second installment of our story. So nothing is set in stone. As I've said that in our lessons, you can change anything at this point. So remember that. Think about the feelings of your character. And if you have a secret, that can help you in the same way that it did for Walker. You're still not sure what to write? That's okay. Go back to your treasure chest. Something there might spark your idea. If you've done a really good job and you've made some notes, whether it's a Post-it note or it's in your actual treasure chest, you may see something that may be tied to what your character wants and their feelings, okay? We're getting a little close to what they need, so think a little bit more about how you could do something that will pull them to their needs when you write your dramatic climax. Be inspired by Mama. Look, she was having a really hard time. She's got these two daughters there on the different poles of the spectrum here. You've got kind Maggie, kind of shy, self-effacing Maggie, and you've got really obnoxious, selfish, boisterous Dee, who's full of energy and telling people how things are going to be. And Maggie's the one hanging back. And Mama is kind of in the middle. She's inspired. She's got to make a decision. She's finally going to be ruled by what she knows is right. And her feelings are guided in this story by what she knows is right. The right thing to do is to let Maggie have those quilts. She knows it. We know it. Dee doesn't ever get it. And she's not the primary character, so that doesn't matter. But Maggie and Mom have a wonderful understanding by the end of that story. And they sit back on the porch. They enjoy a little bit of snuff. And they reflect on the day, and it's where the story began. So it's a beautiful ending, and the resolution, we'll talk about that a little bit more in next week's story, but it's not quite over. But that's the point. Once the climax happens, a lot of stories kind of end at the climax and they don't go to the resolution. I think that's less satisfying, so we're going to talk about that. But once you've written your climax and you're happy with that, you're well over halfway in your story. Okay, the climax is, as I mentioned, your highest plot point. So it's very important to write a satisfying one that works. You can experiment with different ones, and you can say, that doesn't quite work, I want to try this. This is where it's really fun. Your escalation sequence will help you a lot, but your climax, it has to move your character closer to beyond what they want to what they need. Okay, so this is really important. This is an important week. You've done a lot of work. Last week you did for setting the stage. This week is equally important because now we've got to meet that dramatic axis of our story. We've got to hit the nexus of our story here. So by the end of this week, this is important. These are the things we need to do. You need to read Everyday Use. You may have by now, but that's important. That's one of your assignments. Read all the written lectures. They go into much greater detail than I'm able to go into detail on the video. They do highlight a little bit more and give you more pointers for these things, so they'll be helpful. This is a great summary. It has story arcs, but I also have all story arcs in all of the stories we have, starting, I think this week we start to get them, and then through next week we'll do arcs for all of them. You'll want to write your escalation climax and add more details to your treasure chest. This will be really helpful. Remember, you may not use everything in your treasure chest, and that's okay. You want to just have a storage place for them. You may seize on something that you could use in a future story. So it's really important to overpack that treasure chest with lots of treasures. Now you want to type all this into your worksheet, and you want to write the next 1,000 words of your story. We'll have due dates on the assignments in the wet ink module. You want to do another 1,000 words. Now, you may be well over middle. You may be a little more than that. You may be a little under. That's okay. You'll have, by the time you get through writing your story, all 5 essential elements. Where you are in those, I don't know yet, you may not know. Just write where you feel compelled. Let the spirit move you. Let your creative muse really push you towards getting another 1,000 words of your story. And if it's all a hot mess, don't worry about that. I'm really good with structure, and I'll help you format those things in the ways they kind of need to be, especially by the end. So right now, I want you to just enjoy yourself and have fun. Review the lessons if you get stuck. Review the stories if you get stuck. Take lessons from Cheever. Take lessons from Walker. And have fun. And I'll see you again at week 3.